Kyle's hand was already on the doorknob when Duke lunged. The golden retriever, usually the most obedient and gentle dog in the neighborhood, growled deep in his throat and shoved his body between Kyle and the front door. His large, warm eyes were wide with something that looked like desperation, his ears pinned back. "Duke, what's gotten into you? Move, buddy," Kyle said, trying to step around the dog, but Duke only pressed himself harder against the door, blocking the exit entirely. His tail was down, and his body trembled slightly, but his stance was firm. He wasn't going anywhere. "Kyle, what's going on?" came Sarah's voice from the kitchen. His wife stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her blonde hair pulled up in a casual ponytail. Their two kids, Emma and Ben, peeked around her legs, curious. "It's Duke," Kyle said, turning back to the dog. "He won't let me open the door." Sarah frowned. "That's weird. He never does that." Duke let out another low growl, this one directed at the doorknob itself, as if whatever was on the other side posed a terrible threat. He stepped forward and nudged Kyle's leg with his nose before looking back at the rest of the family, his whole body vibrating with urgency. "Duke, stop being weird," Ben said, giggling as he tried to pet the dog, but Duke didn't respond like he normally would. He didn't turn his head or wag his tail. Instead, he gave another warning sound in the back of his throat. "Something's wrong," Sarah said, suddenly feeling uneasy. She grabbed her phone off the counter and opened a local news app. "Let me check." Before she could finish, a loud emergency alert blared from the television in the living room, making them all jump. Kyle reached for the remote and turned the volume up, his heart beginning to race. "This is an emergency broadcast. A severe chemical spill has occurred on Route 57, releasing hazardous fumes into the air. Authorities urge all residents in the area to remain indoors, with all windows and doors closed. Do not attempt to leave your homes until further notice. Repeat, do not leave your homes. This is a shelter-in-place order." Kyle's breath caught in his throat. He and Sarah exchanged stunned looks before turning back to Duke, who now sat by the door, tail flicking anxiously but gaze steady on them all. "He knew," Sarah whispered. "Duke knew." Emma, only 8 years old, clung to her mother's side, eyes wide. "Duke saved us?" Kyle knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his fur. "Looks like it." Duke gave a small, approving huff, before finally wagging his tail, as if to say, "Now you understand." For the next several hours, the family remained inside as authorities worked to contain the spill. Reports came in of people experiencing nausea and dizziness just miles from their home, all from stepping outside at the wrong time. Had Duke not stopped them, they might have been among them. Ben sat cross-legged on the floor beside Duke, scratching behind his ears. "You're the best dog ever." Duke yawned and stretched out on the carpet, finally at ease, his mission complete. He had done what a loyal dog does, protected his family. And as far as Duke was concerned, that was the most important job of all. As the day stretched into evening, Kyle watched the sunset from the window, reflecting on how close they had come to danger. Duke had sensed it before any of them had any idea what was going on. If they had left, if they had stepped outside, even for a minute. He shook his head, not wanting to finish the thought. Instead, he turned and smiled at the dog, now curled up on the couch with Emma and Ben. "We owe you one, boy." Duke thumped his tail against the cushion as if to say, "You're welcome." The next morning, Kyle woke up with a lingering sense of unease. The emergency alert from the night before replayed in his mind as he sat up in bed, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Beside him, Sarah was already awake, scrolling through her phone with a worried expression. Any updates? Kyle asked, his voice groggy. Sarah nodded slowly. They say the chemical spill is under control, but the air quality is still unsafe. They're advising people to stay indoors for at least another 24 hours. She turned the phone toward him, showing a news article that detailed the spill, the hazardous chemicals involved, and the ongoing cleanup efforts. There were a few people who didn't get the warning in time. They had to be hospitalized. Kyle exhaled, running a hand through his hair. We would have been out there if it weren't for Duke. At the sound of his name, Duke lifted his head from his spot at the foot of the bed, his tail giving a slow, lazy wag. His job wasn't done yet, and he knew it. Downstairs, the kids were already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor as cartoons played softly on the television. Emma was brushing Duke's fur, and Ben was trying to balance a treat on Duke's nose. The dog sat perfectly still, his eyes focused on Ben with intense patience. All right, Duke, you can have it, Ben said excitedly. Duke flipped his head up and caught the treat mid-air, chewing it happily as Ben and Emma laughed. Kyle watched from the doorway, a sense of warmth filling his chest. You guys taking good care of Duke? Emma nodded. He saved us, Dad. He deserves all the treats. Kyle smiled and walked toward the kitchen, where Sarah was making coffee. What's the plan for today? He asked, grabbing a mug from the cabinet. Stay inside, keep the kids entertained, and hope the air clears up sooner than expected, Sarah replied. I don't know about you, but I'm already feeling a little stir-crazy. Same here. Kyle glanced out the window. The neighborhood, usually bustling with life, was eerily still. No kids on bikes, no joggers, no cars passing by. It was unsettling. As the day wore on, the sense of confinement grew heavier. They played board games, watched movies, and cooked meals together, but the feeling of being trapped lingered. Kyle found himself checking the news updates frequently, hoping for some good news. By mid-afternoon, Emma and Ben had built a fort in the living room, using blankets and couch cushions, declaring it Duke's Castle. The golden retriever lay inside, perfectly content, as his little kingdom of stuffed animals surrounded him. What do you think, Duke? Emma asked, stroking his head. Is this the best castle ever? Duke let out a happy chuff, his tail thumping against the floor. The kids laughed, but their joy was soon interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock at the door. Kyle and Sarah froze, exchanging nervous glances. Who would be knocking right now? Sarah whispered. Nobody's supposed to be outside. Kyle moved cautiously toward the door and looked through the peephole. A man in a hazmat suit stood on the porch, his face obscured by the thick protective mask. Kyle's stomach tightened. He unlocked the door, but kept it only slightly ajar. Can I help you? He asked warily. The man's voice was muffled behind the mask. Sir, I'm with the emergency response team. We're going door to door making sure everyone is aware of the safety measures. Can I ask if anyone in your household has been feeling unwell? Any dizziness, nausea, headaches? Kyle shook his head. No, we've been staying inside. No symptoms. That's good. If you experience anything unusual, call the number listed on this flyer. The man handed over a laminated paper. Also, we have reason to believe the air quality may not return to safe levels for another 48 hours. It's best to stay put until further notice. Kyle felt his stomach drop. 48 hours? I thought they said 24. It's a fluid situation, the man replied. Better safe than sorry. Kyle nodded stiffly. Thanks for the update. As he closed the door, Duke let out a small whimper. He didn't trust what was happening, and neither did Kyle. When he relayed the information to Sarah, She sighed and rubbed her temples. This just keeps getting worse. I know, Kyle agreed. But we have everything we need. We just have to ride it out. Sarah sat down beside him on the couch, watching the kids play in their fort. You think Duke knew it would get worse? Kyle glanced at the dog, who was now sitting alert, ears perked. Maybe. He's always had good instincts. That night, as they got ready for bed, Duke refused to settle down. He paced near the front door, occasionally sniffing the air. Kyle could sense his unease, and it made his own anxiety spike. Something's still bothering him, Sarah murmured. What if we're missing something? Kyle didn't have an answer. All he knew was that Duke hadn't been wrong before. And something about the way the dog kept glancing at the door made him wonder, was the danger really outside, or was it something else entirely? Kyle barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt a creeping unease settle over him, and every small noise made his muscles tighten. He wasn't the only one who felt it. Duke had refused to settle in his usual spot at the foot of the bed, and instead remained stationed by the bedroom door, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. By morning, Kyle sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Sarah joined him, dark circles under her eyes. Did you get any sleep? She asked quietly. Not much, Kyle admitted. Duke's been acting off all night. Sarah glanced over at Duke, who was still near the door, his posture tense. Something's not right. Before Kyle could respond, Emma and Ben shuffled sleepily into the room, rubbing their eyes. Are we still stuck inside? Ben asked, his voice groggy. Sarah nodded. For now, but we'll make the best of it. Emma looked over at Duke and frowned. He's still acting weird. Kyle sighed and stood up. I know. I'll take him outside for a bit. Maybe he just needs to stretch his legs. Duke perked up at the word outside, but there was still a hesitancy in his stance. Kyle grabbed the leash and opened the back door just enough for Duke to step out. The air outside felt thick and unnatural, even without the chemical scent he'd expected. Duke sniffed the air cautiously, his tail still instead of its usual happy wag. Kyle didn't linger long. As soon as Duke finished his business, he ushered him back inside, locking the door behind them. I don't like this, he murmured to Sarah. The air's supposed to be clear by now. Sarah bit her lip. Should we call someone? Kyle exhaled sharply. And say what? That our dog doesn't like the air? They'd just tell us to stay inside like everyone else. Sarah nodded slowly. I guess we wait. The day dragged on. The kids built more forts, watched their favorite shows, and tried to distract themselves, but the unease in the house remained. Kyle kept checking the news, but updates were sparse. Cleanup was ongoing, and officials were still advising people to stay put. Duke, however, wasn't just unsettled anymore. He was alert. Every time someone moved, he followed. Every time a noise sounded outside, he stiffened. Kyle tried to tell himself that Duke was just being overprotective, but as the day wore on, he started feeling the same inexplicable sense of dread. By late afternoon, Sarah was chopping vegetables for dinner when the power flickered. The lights dimmed, then brightened again, only to shut off completely. Ben let out a startled gasp. What happened? Kyle set his phone's flashlight on. Probably just a temporary outage. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Duke's low growl made the hairs on the back of Kyle's neck stand up. Sarah peered out the window. The whole street's dark. Kyle felt his heart pound harder. This doesn't feel right. Emma grabbed Duke's collar. "He knows something, doesn't he?" Duke let out another quiet growl, his gaze fixed on the front door. A knock sounded. Sarah sucked in a breath. Kyle hesitated before walking toward the door. "Who is it?" Silence. Another knock. Kyle's fingers hovered over the doorknob. His gut told him not to open it, but the rational part of his brain reminded him it could be an official checking on people. He looked through the peephole. No one was there. His blood turned cold. He checked again, blinking rapidly, but the porch was empty. Duke let out a single, sharp bark. His entire body was bristling, muscles tight. Kyle backed away from the door slowly. "There's no one there." Sarah's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" "Someone knocked." Kyle shook his head. "I know, but there's no one there." Emma clutched Ben's hand. "I don't like this." Duke moved toward the door, sniffing deeply before letting out another growl, this time louder. Kyle's heart was pounding. Something was wrong. He didn't know what, but every instinct screamed at him that they weren't just dealing with an environmental threat anymore. They weren't alone. Kyle took a slow, measured breath, keeping his eyes locked on the door. His pulse pounded in his ears, but he refused to let fear take over. Instead, he turned to Duke, who still stood rigid and unmoving, ears perked high, eyes sharp. The golden retriever's muscles were tense, as if he was waiting for something to happen. Sarah's hand found Kyle's, squeezing tight. "What do we do?" she whispered, glancing at the door like it might fly open on its own. Kyle didn't have an answer. "We stay put," he finally said, voice steady despite the unease creeping up his spine. "No one opens that door. No one goes outside." Ben and Emma huddled closer to their mother, their small faces scrunched with worry. Emma clutched Duke's fur like a security blanket, burying her face into his side. The dog let out a small huff, his way of comforting her while still keeping his attention trained on the unseen threat. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then another sound. This time it wasn't a knock but a faint scratching noise, a slow, dragging scrape against the door, followed by another. Kyle's stomach twisted. He stepped forward cautiously, positioning himself between the door and his family. The scraping stopped. Then came a new sound, something tapping lightly against the window. Kyle snapped his head toward it, and though he couldn't see much beyond the darkness outside, he knew something was there. He wasn't about to investigate. Sarah inhaled sharply. "Kyle?" "I know." His voice was barely above a whisper. "We need to move away from the windows. Everybody, stay together." Sarah herded the kids toward the center of the living room, where the blanket fort still stood. Kyle grabbed his phone, flipping it open to check for service. The power had gone out earlier, but maybe cell reception was still working. No signal. He let out a quiet curse under his breath. "We need to focus. The doors stay locked, the windows stay closed, and we do not separate." Sarah nodded, but her hands trembled as she clutched Ben's shoulders. Emma kept her arms wrapped around Duke, who had yet to move from his stance in front of the door. Another knock, louder this time. Kyle swallowed hard. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. Every instinct screamed at him not to open the door, not to check, not to engage with whatever was outside. Duke's quiet, low growl reinforced that gut feeling. Then came a voice. "Hello? Anyone home?" Kyle stiffened. The voice was male, deep, but oddly distant, like it wasn't coming from directly outside the door, but somewhere just beyond the porch. Sarah gasped, her grip tightening on the kids. Ben's eyes widened. "Someone's there." Kyle didn't respond. His mind worked quickly. He didn't trust this. Not one bit. "Sir, ma'am, we need to speak with you." The voice was clearer now, more insistent. "It's about the emergency alert. We're with the response team." Kyle's blood ran cold. No, he didn't believe that. He glanced at Sarah, shaking his head slightly. He wouldn't be fooled. Not when Duke was still acting like danger lurked just outside their home. A beat of silence stretched between them all. Then the voice changed. The tone was softer now. "Please, we need help." Emma whimpered. "Daddy." Kyle took a careful step toward the door, still keeping his weight balanced, his body prepared to move quickly if needed. He glanced through the peephole again. Nothing. Not a shadow, not a figure, just the dim glow of their front porch light flickering weakly in the night. "We're not opening the door," Kyle called back, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Silence. Then came a new sound. Something heavy shifting on the porch, the creak of the wooden boards under an unseen weight. Duke's growl deepened. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving away. Kyle's heart pounded against his ribs as the steps faded into the distance. The tension in the room was suffocating. He waited a full minute before exhaling. "Are they gone?" Sarah asked, barely above a whisper. Kyle ran a hand down his face. "I don't know." The kids clung to their mother, their wide, fearful eyes searching for reassurance. Duke, however, hadn't relaxed. His ears were still perked, his body still alert. Kyle didn't trust it. He didn't trust any of this. Then, as if the universe wanted to prove him right, something outside let out a loud, unnatural screech. The sound rattled through the house like nails on a chalkboard, making everyone flinch. Duke barked loudly, stepping forward, placing himself between his family and the unseen horror outside. Sarah clapped her hands over her ears, her face twisted in terror. "What was that?" Kyle didn't have an answer. The sound came again. Longer this time, almost human, but wrong. Warped, distorted. Whatever was outside wasn't normal. It wasn't just a stranger or an animal. It was something else. Kyle grabbed Sarah's hand. "We are not going outside." Sarah nodded, her breath shaky. "We stay here. Together." The kids clung tighter to Duke, who never once broke his stance. He wasn't just being protective anymore. He was ready. Ready to defend them against whatever nightmare lurked beyond their front door. And for the first time, Kyle realized something terrifying. Whatever was out there, it wasn't leaving. Kyle tightened his grip on Sarah's hand as Duke remained still, his eyes fixated on the door. The eerie screech from outside had rattled everyone, but Duke's reaction made it clear. This wasn't over. "We need to get away from the windows," Kyle whispered, his voice tight. "Now." Sarah nodded quickly, guiding Emma and Ben toward the hallway. The kids clung to her, their small hands trembling. Kyle followed closely behind, his body tense as he listened for any further sounds from outside. The house was eerily silent, except for the occasional flicker of their battery-powered lantern casting shadows on the walls. The power was still out, and without any signal on their phones, they were completely cut off from the outside world. Kyle had never felt so helpless. Duke let out a soft, warning growl, his ears twitching as he sniffed the air. His body was still on high alert, his stance firm. Kyle trusted the dog's instincts more than anything right now. "Where do we go?" Emma's voice wavered as she held onto her mother's waist. "The basement," Kyle said after a moment. "It's safer there, fewer windows, and if anything happens, we can barricade ourselves in." Sarah hesitated, but nodded. Okay. They moved quickly but cautiously, every step feeling heavier than the last. Duke stayed ahead of them, his movement smooth but guarded. Kyle carried the lantern in one hand, his other resting against Sarah's back as they descended the wooden steps into the basement. The air down there was colder, the faint smell of dampness filling their noses. Kyle placed the lantern on a shelf and turned to his family. "We stay here, no matter what." Ben whimpered. "But what if—" Kyle cut him off with a gentle but firm look. "No matter what, we stay put." Duke paced near the door, his body still tense. Kyle crouched down next to him, rubbing his fur for reassurance, not just for Duke, but for himself. The dog had sensed the danger long before any of them had, and Kyle wasn't going to ignore that again. Time passed slowly. Every creak of the house above made Kyle's pulse spike. Sarah kept the kids close, whispering soft reassurances, even though she herself was terrified. Then, footsteps. Kyle's breath caught. They weren't inside the house, not yet. But they were close, slow, deliberate steps against the ground outside. Then another noise, like something being dragged along the porch. Duke stood rigid, a deep growl rising from his throat. Sarah's grip on Emma and Ben tightened as she pressed them closer to her side. Kyle motioned for everyone to stay quiet. His own breathing slowed as he listened carefully, trying to determine what was outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just an animal. The dragging noise stopped. The footsteps stopped. Then, a tap. Not on the front door, not on the windows, but directly above them on the floorboards of the main level of the house. Someone, something, was inside. Kyle's stomach clenched. He met Sarah's wide, terrified eyes and knew they were all thinking the same thing. "How?" Duke's growl deepened, but Kyle quickly reached out, pressing a hand to the dog's fur in an attempt to keep him quiet. If they made any noise now, whoever was above them would know exactly where they were. A shuffling sound moved across the floor, slow and heavy. The footsteps weren't rushed. They were searching. Kyle's pulse pounded against his temples as he fought the urge to move, to do something, but he knew their best chance was to stay hidden. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Then the footsteps moved toward the stairs leading down to the basement. Kyle's entire body went rigid. His mind raced. The door at the top of the stairs was closed, but it wasn't locked. He cursed himself for not thinking of that earlier. He had no weapon, no way to defend his family except his own body. The doorknob jiggled. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath, her arms tightening around the kids. Ben whimpered, and Kyle shook his head sharply, silently pleading for him to stay quiet. Then, a voice, a whisper, raspy and unnatural. "I know you're there." The words sent a chill down Kyle's spine. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay completely still. Duke let out a low growl, but Kyle pressed down on his back, silently urging him not to make a sound. The doorknob twisted again. Then, silence. Seconds stretched into minutes. The air was thick with tension, every single member of the family frozen in place. Then the footsteps retreated. Kyle didn't move until he could no longer hear them. Then, with careful movements, he crept toward the basement door, pressing his ear against the wood. Nothing. Duke had relaxed slightly, but remained alert, his ears flicking at every small sound. Kyle turned back to his family, his voice barely above a whisper. "We stay here. All night." Kyle barely allowed himself to breathe. The quiet in the basement was suffocating, thick with the tension of not knowing who, was upstairs. Every muscle in his body was wound tight, ready to act at the slightest movement above. The weight of the situation sat heavy on his chest, but his priority was keeping his family safe. Duke's ears twitched, his body still coiled with alertness. He wasn't growling anymore, but his breathing was heavy, measured, as if he was just as unsure of what would come next. Kyle kept his hand on the dog's back, steadying him just as much as he was steadying himself. Sarah kept the kids huddled close, their small hands gripping her arms. Emma's breathing was shaky, and Ben's lip trembled. They were being so brave, but Kyle could see the fear in their eyes. He wanted nothing more than to tell them everything would be okay, but he wouldn't lie to them. Not when he didn't know what was waiting for them beyond the basement door. A sound. Faint. From above. Kyle's grip on Duke tightened instinctively. He tilted his head, straining to listen. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing. The hair on the back of his neck rose. Whoever had been at the door hadn't left. They were still in the house. Sarah's grip on his wrist tightened. He turned his head, seeing her wide, questioning eyes. He shook his head slightly. They had to wait. Then, something shifted. The footsteps stopped, followed by a faint, scraping noise. Kyle clenched his jaw. It was coming from the living room. He pictured the furniture they had left undisturbed before coming downstairs. Something was being moved. His heart pounded harder. Was the intruder searching for something? Or were they simply making themselves at home? Duke let out a low, barely audible whine. Kyle knew he was fighting the urge to bark. He scratched the dog's neck softly, wordlessly assuring him they were okay. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Maybe longer. The waiting was unbearable. The intruder didn't seem to be in a hurry to leave. Kyle had to consider the possibility that they had no intention of leaving at all. Then came another sound. A chair scraping against the floor. A long, slow movement, the kind that made Kyle's stomach tighten. And then, a voice. "Where are you?" Kyle stiffened. The voice was low, eerily calm. It didn't sound frantic, angry, or rushed. It was worse than that. It was patient. Whoever they were, they knew Kyle and his family were inside. They were waiting for them to make a mistake. Sarah sucked in a sharp breath, barely audible, but Kyle caught it. He shook his head again, silently begging her to stay still. Emma buried her face into Sarah's side. Ben clung to his mother's arm. Silence stretched again. Kyle didn't dare move. Then, slow steps, this time toward the basement door. The air in the room turned ice cold. The doorknob jiggled. Sarah gripped the kids tighter, her fingers digging into their arms. Duke's body tensed, his tail stiff as he prepared for whatever came next. Kyle moved to stand, positioning himself between his family and the door. If it came down to it, he would not let anything get past him. Another jiggle, a pause, and then a quiet chuckle. Kyle's stomach twisted. That sound was worse than anything else. It was taunting, mocking. Whoever was upstairs wasn't afraid. They were enjoying this. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated. Kyle waited. 5 minutes? 10. 20. He kept his stance firm, his body alert. The tension in the room remained, but no further sounds followed. Finally, he allowed himself to move. He crouched beside Duke, whispering so low only the dog could hear. "You hear anything?" Duke flicked his ears but didn't react otherwise. His breathing had slowed slightly. Kyle took that as a good sign. He turned back to Sarah, speaking just as quietly. "We have to assume they're still inside." She swallowed hard but nodded. "What do we do?" Kyle hesitated. If they stayed down here, they were sitting ducks. But if they went upstairs, they were walking into the unknown. "We wait a little longer," he decided. "Then we check." Time passed painfully slow. Kyle kept his back against the door, listening to every creak of the house. Eventually, Duke relaxed, just a little. That was the only sign Kyle needed. He stood carefully, keeping his movements slow and measured. He motioned for Sarah to stay with the kids as he cracked the door open just an inch. Silence. He pushed it open wider, stepping cautiously onto the first stair. He listened. Nothing. Duke followed close behind him, his nails clicking against the wooden steps as they ascended. The air upstairs felt different. It was still. Too still. Kyle stepped into the living room and immediately spotted what had changed. The chair, the one they had left neatly tucked under the table, was now turned around, facing the basement door, as if someone had been sitting, waiting. His stomach flipped. He looked around. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, but someone had been inside. Someone who had come and gone without a trace. Duke sniffed the air, his tail lowering slightly. His posture had relaxed, just enough for Kyle to know the immediate threat was gone. But that didn't mean they were safe. Kyle's breath felt shallow as he scanned the living room, his muscles taut and ready to react. The chair sitting in front of the basement door sent a wave of unease through him. Someone had been sitting there, watching, waiting. Duke sniffed the air, his nose twitching as he moved cautiously around the room. His tail remained low, not quite between his legs, but not relaxed either. It was a warning. The immediate danger might have passed, but something wasn't right. Kyle took another careful step forward, his eyes flicking toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The air in the house felt different, charged, as if something had been disturbed. He glanced toward the front door. The locks were still in place, the chain still latched. There was no sign of forced entry. So, how had they gotten in? His fingers curled into fists. They had been asleep when it happened. That thought sent a cold spike through his spine. Had someone been walking around their home, undetected, while they were unaware? The idea made his stomach churn. He couldn't let his family stay vulnerable any longer. He turned back toward the basement door. "Sarah," he called quietly. "Come up, but stay close to the kids." A moment later, he heard the soft creak of the basement steps. Sarah appeared first, her face pale and drawn, Emma and Ben close behind her. She scanned the room quickly, her hands instinctively reaching out to her children, pulling them in close. "What do you see?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Kyle shook his head. "No one's here now, but someone was." The chair, he motioned toward it. They were sitting there, right outside the basement door. Sarah's grip on the kids tightened. Emma buried her face in her mother's side, while Ben's wide eyes darted around the room. How did they get in? Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. I don't know, Kyle admitted. Nothing's broken. The doors were locked. He glanced down at Duke, who was still sniffing the air, moving toward the hallway. But Duke knows something's off. Sarah's breath caught. Are they still inside? Kyle shook his head. I don't think so. Duke would be reacting differently if they were. Sarah hesitated before nodding. What do we do now? Kyle's mind raced. We need to check every room. Make sure nothing else has been disturbed. Sarah swallowed hard, but nodded. She knew they had no choice. Kyle moved first, stepping cautiously down the hallway. He opened the first door. Ben's room. The bed was unmade, stuffed animals scattered across the floor, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, Kyle's eyes moved toward the closet. He hesitated before reaching for the handle. Duke padded up beside him, nose twitching. Kyle pulled the door open quickly. Nothing. Exhaling, he moved on to Emma's room. Same thing. Messy but untouched. He checked the closet, under the bed. Nothing. Then they reached the master bedroom. Kyle hesitated. Something felt different here. The air was heavier. He stepped inside, scanning the room. The bed was as they had left it. But then his eyes landed on the nightstand. His heart skipped a beat. The drawer was open. Kyle knew for a fact he had closed it before going to bed. His stomach twisted as he moved toward it, his hand hovering over the handle. He pulled it open further. His wedding ring was gone. Kyle's pulse pounded in his ears. His ring. He had taken it off the night before, placing it in the drawer like he always did. Now it was missing. A new kind of fear settled over him. This wasn't just about someone breaking in. This was personal. Someone had been inside their room, inches from where they slept, and they had taken something meant to be untouchable. He turned to Sarah, his face set. We're not staying here. Sarah's eyes widened. Kyle, we're not safe. His voice was firm. Whoever was here, they didn't just come in to scare us. They took something. They were in our room, Sarah, while we were sleeping. Sarah's breath shuddered. Where do we go? Kyle's mind worked fast. We pack up, take only essentials. We're going to my parents' place. Sarah hesitated, but nodded. Okay, I'll grab the kids' things. Kyle looked down at Duke, whose eyes were still trained on the hallway. Duke comes with us. Sarah gave a shaky nod. Of course. They moved quickly. Sarah packed a bag for the kids while Kyle grabbed the essentials. Every minute felt like an eternity, his ears trained for any sound, any movement. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but he knew they had no choice. Duke stayed close, his body still rigid with tension. Within 10 minutes, they were at the door. Kyle opened it cautiously, scanning the dark street outside. He had no idea if whoever had been in their home was still nearby. The thought made his skin crawl. Let's go, he said quietly. They moved fast, getting the kids into the car. Duke jumped into the back seat without hesitation. Kyle slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors the second they were inside. His hands were tight on the wheel as he pulled away from the house. Only when they were a few streets away did he finally let out the breath he had been holding. Sarah reached over, gripping his arm. What do we do now? She asked again. Kyle exhaled. We figure out who's been watching us. Because one thing was clear. Whoever had come into their home, they weren't done yet. Kyle kept checking the rearview mirror as he drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The road was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Duke sat in the back seat with Emma and Ben, his large frame pressed against the door, ears twitching with every small sound. Sarah was quiet, her eyes scanning the dark streets as they passed through town. The kids, exhausted from the chaos of the night, leaned against each other, their small bodies curled into the safety of their car seats. The hum of the engine was the only thing breaking the silence. "Do you think they followed us?" Sarah finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kyle shook his head but didn't look away from the road. "I don't know, but I wasn't going to stay there and find out." They had left everything behind in a matter of minutes, packing only what they could carry in a hurry. His parents' house was a 40-minute drive away, and right now that felt like the safest place they could be. But the nagging feeling in his gut told him this wasn't over. Not yet. Duke let out a low whimper, shifting slightly in his seat. His eyes never left the rear windshield. "Something's wrong," Emma murmured, barely awake. Sarah turned to her. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Emma rubbed her eyes, sitting up straighter. "Duke feels it too." Kyle swallowed hard. The dog had been right before. Every time. He pressed harder on the gas, his mind racing. Had they really gotten away? Or were they just giving whoever had been inside their house more time to find them again? They reached his parents' house just after midnight. The lights were off, but Kyle knew his parents always left the side door unlocked for him. He parked in the driveway and cut the engine, sitting in silence for a moment before turning to Sarah. "We go in fast and lock everything behind us," he said. "Grab the bags, I'll get the kids." Sarah nodded and took a deep breath, bracing herself before stepping out. Kyle followed, opening the back door and carefully lifting Emma into his arms. She stirred, but didn't wake. Ben clung to Sarah, his small hands gripping the fabric of her sweater as they hurried up the walkway. Duke jumped out last, his body tense, eyes darting around the dark street. He let out a low growl, his head turning toward the trees lining the property. Kyle didn't stop to look. He unlocked the door, ushering his family inside before shutting and bolting it behind them. Only when the lock clicked into place did he finally breathe. His parents' house felt warm, safe, but that feeling didn't last long. Something still felt off. Kyle couldn't explain it, but he knew it wasn't just paranoia. It was something deeper. Sarah set the bags down, rubbing her arms. "Should we wake them up?" Kyle shook his head. "Not yet. Let's just get the kids settled first." They moved quickly, carrying the sleeping children to the guest room. Emma stirred as Kyle set her down, but her breathing evened out almost immediately. Ben curled up without a sound, his tiny body still tense, even in sleep. Kyle brushed a hand over his son's hair before stepping back. Sarah watched him. "We should talk in the kitchen." Kyle nodded, leading the way. He grabbed the house phone, checking for a dial tone. There was one. That was good. At least they weren't completely cut off. Sarah sat at the table, her hands clasped. "Kyle, what if—" A noise outside cut her off. Duke's head snapped toward the back door, his ears rising. A second later, he let out a deep, warning bark that made the hairs on Kyle's arms stand on end. Sarah gasped. "Kyle, I hear it." Another noise. This time a shuffle near the window. Kyle's eyes darted toward the curtains, barely seeing movement just beyond the glass. They weren't alone. Kyle moved fast, grabbing the nearest object, an old fireplace poker leaning against the wall. He motioned for Sarah to stay put before creeping toward the back door. Duke was already there, his body low, growls rumbling from his chest. Kyle peered through the window. He couldn't see much, just the outline of the trees swaying in the night breeze. But then, a shadow moved. Someone was standing near the tree line, watching. Kyle's heart slammed against his ribs. He gripped the poker tighter. Then, whoever it was stepped back, disappearing into the trees. For a long moment, Kyle just stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been. Duke didn't stop growling, his gaze locked onto the same spot. Sarah's voice was shaky. Was it them? Kyle turned, his jaw tight. I don't know, but we need to wake my parents, now. Kyle moved quickly, his bare feet silent against the floor as he made his way toward his parents' bedroom. The house felt too quiet, too still, as if it was holding its breath. He tapped lightly on the door before pushing it open. Mom, Dad, he whispered urgently. Wake up! His mother stirred first, blinking groggily before sitting up. Kyle, what's wrong? His father was already rising, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Son? What is it? Kyle hesitated, but only for a moment. There's someone outside. That got their attention. His father swung his legs over the bed, immediately alert. You sure? Kyle nodded. Duke saw them too. We need to make sure all the doors and windows are locked. His father stood without another word, already moving toward the hallway. Kyle followed him out, his mother not far behind. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her arms wrapped around herself. Duke stood rigid near the back door, his gaze still fixed on the darkness outside. I saw them too, Sarah said, her voice hushed. They were watching. Kyle clenched his jaw. We need to call the police. His father nodded, grabbing the house phone from the counter and dialing. The sound of the dial tone filled the room, but when he pressed the numbers, there was nothing. Just silence. His father frowned, pressing the receiver against his ear. The line's dead. Kyle's stomach sank. What? No way. I just checked it. His father tried again, pressing different buttons, but there was still nothing. Just that empty, deafening silence. It's been cut, Kyle realized, his voice low. Whoever's out there, they did this. Sarah let out a shaky breath, pulling Ben and Emma closer to her side. Kyle's mother turned toward him, her expression unreadable. What do we do? Kyle ran a hand through his hair, thinking fast. We secure the house first, lock everything, then we stay together. No one goes outside. His father nodded in agreement. I have a shotgun in the safe, just in case. Kyle exhaled. Good. They moved quickly. Every door and window was checked, double-checked. The house was locked down as tightly as possible, but that didn't ease the tension pressing down on them. Duke stayed close to the back door, his ears perked, body still tense. Kyle crouched beside him, rubbing his fur. You hear anything, boy? Duke let out a low, rumbling growl. Kyle stiffened. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, came from outside. A faint creak, like someone stepping on an old wooden board. Kyle's father returned, the shotgun in hand. We're not waiting for them to make the first move. Kyle exchanged a glance with him, nodding. Stay inside. If they try to get in, we defend ourselves. His father set his jaw. Agreed. Then, a loud knock at the front door. Everyone froze. The knock came again. steady, calm. "Kyle?" a voice called through the door. "I know you're in there." Kyle's stomach dropped. The voice was familiar, too familiar. His father's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Who the hell is that?" Kyle swallowed hard, his mind racing. He knew that voice. He hadn't heard it in years, but it was unmistakable. It was Mark, his old friend, the one who had vanished years ago without a trace. "Kyle," Mark called again. "Open up, man. I just want to talk." Kyle's fingers curled into fists. He didn't move, didn't answer. Then, a chuckle. Low, almost amused. "Come on, buddy. I know you're listening." Kyle forced himself to breathe. "Mark?" Silence stretched for a moment before Mark spoke again. "Yeah, it's me. Open the door." Kyle shook his head, stepping closer to the door, but keeping a safe distance. "What the hell are you doing here? It's the middle of the night." Another chuckle. "I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd drop by." Kyle's blood ran cold. That wasn't right. None of this was right. Duke growled again, his body shifting closer to Kyle. "Go away, Mark." Kyle's voice was steady. "We're not opening the door." Silence. Then, "That's a shame." A pause. "I guess I'll see you soon." Kyle's breath caught in his throat. Then footsteps. Slow, deliberate, retreating into the night. Kyle didn't dare move until he was sure Mark was gone. His father exhaled, lowering the shotgun slightly. "You know him?" Kyle nodded. "I did, but not anymore." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Kyle, what does this mean?" Kyle looked out the window, staring into the darkness beyond. "It means we're not safe yet." Kyle couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, his fingers gripping a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. His father sat across from him, the shotgun resting within arm's reach. Sarah had taken the kids to the guest room, locking the door behind them, but Kyle knew none of them would be getting much rest tonight. Mark. The name repeated itself in his mind, over and over. It had been years since he had last seen him, years since Mark had disappeared without a trace. And now he was back, in the middle of the night, lurking outside their home with a voice too calm, too knowing. Duke sat by the back door, his ears perked, his posture rigid. Every so often his nose twitched, and he let out a low growl. Kyle trusted the dog's instincts more than anything else right now. His father finally spoke, voice gruff. "Tell me about Mark." Kyle exhaled sharply. "We were close once, friends since middle school. He was always the adventurous type, the one who wanted to go out and see the world. But after high school, he just vanished. No warning, no goodbyes. Just gone." His father frowned. "And now he's here? In the middle of the night, creeping around like a damn ghost?" Kyle nodded. "That wasn't just a friendly visit. He was testing us, seeing how we'd react." His father leaned back, jaw tight. "And the phone line? You think he had something to do with that?" "I don't know," Kyle admitted. "But it's too much of a coincidence." Silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, but Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there. Watching. Waiting. Then, Duke tensed. Kyle immediately sat forward, eyes darting to the dog. Duke's gaze was fixed on the front door now, his growl deepening. His body was low, ears pinned back. His father reached for the shotgun. A sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, stopping just beyond the porch. Kyle's pulse pounded in his ears. He exchanged a look with his father, then stood, careful not to make a sound as he moved toward the front window. He shifted the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing. But Duke was still growling. Then, a shadow. Just at the edge of the yard, near the tree line. It moved, shifting slightly, the figure barely illuminated by the dim glow of the street lamp. Kyle's breath caught. The posture, the stance. It was Mark. But he wasn't alone. Another figure stood beside him. And another. 3 in total. Watching. Kyle stepped back, his heart racing. "Dad, there's more of them." His father stood slowly, eyes dark with understanding. "We're not dealing with just one man." Kyle swallowed hard. "No, we're not." The knocking returned, louder this time. "Kyle," Mark's voice called. "Come on, open the door. We just want to talk." Kyle clenched his jaw. "Go away, Mark." A long pause, then a chuckle. "You always were the careful one, weren't you? Never took risks, never stepped out of line." Kyle didn't answer. Another chuckle. "That's okay. We'll wait." Then, silence. Kyle waited, his breath shallow. He counted the seconds. 1 minute. 2. 5. He dared to look through the window again. The yard was empty. They were gone. Duke's ears flicked, but he no longer growled. The tension in the room remained thick, but the immediate danger had passed. For now. Kyle's father let out a slow breath. "They'll be back." Kyle nodded. "I know." His father's grip on the shotgun tightened. "Then we need to be ready." Kyle took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the doorknob. He wasn't reckless, but he also wasn't going to let them sit around and wait for Mark to make his next move. His father kept the shotgun ready, standing just behind him. Duke was stiff with tension, his eyes fixed on the shadow near the fence. "We don't go out unless we have a plan," his father whispered. "We need to control the situation." Kyle nodded. "We confront him, see what he wants. We don't let them get the upper hand." Sarah had crept closer, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you sure this is a good idea? What if they have weapons? What if there are more of them waiting?" Kyle exhaled slowly. "That's why we're careful. We don't step outside the house. We talk from the porch. If they try anything, we go back inside." His father motioned toward the front. "We use both doors. They expect us from the back, but I'll take the front. We corner them between us." Kyle hesitated. Splitting up made him nervous, but his father's experience wasn't something he could ignore. "All right, I'll take the back. You take the front. If anything goes wrong, get inside immediately." Sarah's hand touched his arm, grounding him for a brief moment. "Be careful." Kyle gave her a small nod before unlocking the back door. He stepped out cautiously, keeping one hand on the frame and the other ready to pull the door closed if necessary. Mark was still there, standing near the fence, but he didn't move toward Kyle. The other 2 figures had stepped back into the trees, partially obscured by the early morning shadows. Kyle kept his posture neutral but firm. "What do you want, Mark?" Mark tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning Kyle like he was trying to read him. "I told you, I just wanted to talk." Kyle's fingers twitched. "You don't show up in the middle of the night with 2 strangers and cut the phone line if you just want to talk." Mark chuckled, shaking his head. "I forgot how sharp you were. Always thinking ahead." Kyle's father appeared on the front porch, the shotgun visible in his hands. "You're trespassing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And we don't take kindly to threats." Mark's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted. That's a little dramatic, don't you think? We haven't done anything. Kyle narrowed his eyes. Not yet, but I don't trust you, Mark. Not after the way you disappeared, not after the way you came back. Mark sighed, taking a slow step forward. Duke let out a low, warning growl. Mark stopped. All right. You want the truth? Fine. You're in danger, Kyle. Your whole family is. I came to warn you. Kyle stiffened. Warn me about what? Mark glanced toward the trees, where the other two figures remained hidden. Them, and the people they work for. Kyle's father scoffed. You expect us to believe you? That you show up with two men in the middle of the night scaring my family and now you're trying to play the hero? Mark's eyes darkened. You don't know what's happening, Mr. Walker, and I don't have time to explain it all right now. But you need to leave. Tonight. Kyle clenched his jaw. We're not running. Not until you tell me exactly what's going on. Mark sighed again, rubbing his temples. There are people looking for you, Kyle. And not just me. They know where you are. They sent me here first because I knew you. They thought it might help. But if I don't convince you to leave, they'll send others. And they won't be nearly as friendly. Kyle's stomach turned. Who are they? Mark hesitated. I can't say. Not yet. But they're watching, and they won't stop. Kyle's father stepped forward. If you know so much, why are you still here? Why haven't they taken action already? Mark's lips pressed together. Because they're waiting, testing you, seeing how you react. If you run, they'll know you're afraid. If you fight back, they'll escalate. And if you do nothing, they'll make their move. Kyle exhaled sharply. His mind raced through the possibilities. He didn't want to believe Mark, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just some elaborate trick. Sarah called from inside. Kyle, we need to talk. Now! Kyle turned, seeing the urgency in her face. He glanced back at Mark. You stay right there. If you move, we're done. Mark raised his hands. I get it. Take your time. But don't take too long. Kyle stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her expression pale. Kyle, the kids heard something. They said someone was at the window while we were outside. Kyle's blood ran cold. What? Ben and Emma stood near the hallway, their small faces full of fear. Emma clutched her brother's hand. We saw someone, Daddy. They were looking in. Kyle crouched down. Where? Ben pointed toward the side of the house, near the living room window. Over there. They didn't move for a long time. Then they were just gone. Kyle's chest tightened. He looked back at his father. They're surrounding us, testing every entrance. His father nodded grimly. Then it's time we stop waiting. Kyle's father turned back toward the window, gripping the shotgun tightly. We have to assume they're watching every move we make. They know our defenses. We need to change the game. Kyle nodded. We have to be unpredictable. Move fast and catch them off guard. Sarah swallowed hard. But how? Kyle thought for a moment. We need to set a trap. We can't wait for them to come to us. We have to control how they approach. His father smirked. I have an idea. We'll make them think we're scared. Make them think we're running. But we set the terms of engagement. Sarah hesitated, but nodded. Just promise me one thing. No one gets hurt unless we have no other choice. Kyle met her eyes and took her hand. I promise. But we're not going to let them win either. He turned back toward the door, glancing out toward where Mark still stood, waiting. This wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. This was about taking control before it was too late. The night dragged on with an uneasy stillness. Kyle's father stood by the window, keeping an eye on the property while Kyle checked the locks once again. Duke remained alert, occasionally pacing between the front and back doors. Sarah appeared in the hallway, rubbing her tired eyes. Did they leave? For now, Kyle answered. But I doubt they're done. She glanced toward the living room, where Ben and Emma lay asleep under blankets. I don't like this. We can't just wait for them to come back. Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. But if we try to leave, we might be walking into a trap. We don't know how many of them there are, or what they want. His father nodded. They're playing a game with us, trying to wear us down. Kyle clenched his fists. Well, we're not going to break. The hours ticked by, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Duke tensed again. A rustling sound, near the back of the house. Kyle's father lifted the shotgun, stepping carefully toward the rear window. Kyle moved to the other side, peeking through the blinds. A figure stood near the fence, unmoving. Mark. But this time he wasn't smiling. His face was twisted in something else, determination. Kyle's father whispered, "We need to do something before they do." Kyle nodded, gripping the door handle. Then let's finish this. Kyle's grip on the doorframe tightened as he took in Sarah's expression. Fear clung to the edges of her voice, but behind it was something else. Urgency. This wasn't just paranoia. Whatever game Mark and his people were playing, it had escalated. They weren't just watching. They were making moves. His father set the shotgun on the counter, jaw tight. All right, let's lay it all out. We've got Mark and 2 guys out back, possibly more hidden. They've cut the phone line, been circling the house, and now the kids saw someone at the window. That's not random intimidation. That's an attack plan in motion. Kyle nodded. Which means we're out of time. We have to act now. Sarah's hand gripped his forearm, her eyes pleading. What does that mean? Are we running? Are we fighting? We can't just sit here waiting for them to break in? Kyle glanced at his father. We stick to the plan. We make them think we're running, but we set the terms. His father exhaled slowly, nodding. We need to force them into a position where we control the next move. Kyle turned to Sarah. Get the kids ready. Pack only what's necessary. Keep it quiet. We want them to think we're panicking. She hesitated, but nodded, quickly moving toward the hallway. Kyle's father rubbed his chin, deep in thought. What's the setup? We're not just walking out the front door into their hands. Kyle motioned toward the back window, keeping his voice low. We load the car up, make it look like we're rushing. We leave the front lights on, draw them toward the house. Then we slip out the back and into the woods. His father raised an eyebrow. And then? Then we turn the tables, Kyle said. We stop reacting. We go on offense. His father's lips curled slightly, the kind of smirk Kyle recognized from years of tough lessons. Now we're talking. They moved quickly. Sarah gathered the kids' things, whispering reassurances to Emma and Ben, keeping them calm as best she could. Kyle and his father worked in near silence, stacking bags by the back door, making sure their movements could be seen through the windows. The performance had to be perfect, rushed but not sloppy, afraid but not reckless. Duke stayed at Kyle's side, his ears twitching with every sound from outside. The dog wasn't just waiting. He was listening, learning. A shuffle from the trees sent a jolt through Kyle's spine. He leaned slightly, just enough to catch the movement near the fence. Mark was still there, but he wasn't alone anymore. The other two had moved closer, watching, waiting. "They're getting impatient," his father murmured. "Good." Sarah emerged from the hallway, her face pale but steady. "The kids are ready." Kyle nodded. "Then it's time." They moved in calculated steps. Kyle carried the duffel bags out first, tossing them into the back of the SUV with just enough force to sell the illusion of rushed panic. His father followed, keys jingling, making sure the sound carried. Sarah ushered the kids out next, keeping them close, her hand tight around Emma's. The reaction was immediate. A figure shifted from the trees, then another. They were closing in. Kyle's heart pounded, but he didn't let it show. He kept moving, eyes flicking between the shadows. He needed them to take the bait. Then, movement. Mark took a step forward, his voice cutting through the tense night. "Kyle, wait!" Kyle froze, turning just enough to see the man's face. The calm facade was slipping. Mark wasn't just playing anymore. He was desperate. "You don't have to do this," Mark continued. "You don't understand what's happening." Kyle swallowed the bitter taste in his throat. "Then tell me." Mark hesitated. The others shifted behind him. Too close now. Too eager. Kyle's father muttered under his breath. "They're waiting for a signal." Kyle clenched his jaw. "Then we don't give them one." Without another word, he moved. Not toward the car, but away from it. Straight into the trees. Sarah didn't hesitate. She turned, pulling the kids with her, moving fast but steady. His father followed, shotgun in hand, eyes sharp. The shift was immediate. Mark's expression twisted, his hesitation turning into action. "No! Stop them!" Kyle ran. The forest swallowed them instantly, thick and dark, the ground uneven beneath their feet. He heard them behind him, branches snapping, footsteps pounding. They had taken the bait. But Kyle wasn't running away. He was leading them exactly where he wanted them. His father moved beside him, voice low but firm. "Half a mile ahead, we break left. There's an old hunting blind. Good cover." Kyle nodded, breath steady. "We make them come to us." Sarah was just ahead, keeping the kids moving. Ben stumbled, but she caught him, whispering reassurances, never slowing down. Duke darted ahead, his body low, muscles coiled. He knew this was more than just a run. They weren't escaping. They were preparing for the fight. Kyle's breath was steady, but his pulse pounded against his temples as he ran. The forest loomed around them, thick and unrelenting, its dense branches scraping against his arms as he moved. Sarah was just ahead, guiding the kids with careful steps, her grip firm on Emma's wrist, while Ben clutched her other hand. His father ran beside him, keeping pace despite his age, the shotgun held close to his chest, ready to be used at a moment's notice. The shouts from behind grew louder. The men were following them, their footsteps crunching against the undergrowth. Kyle didn't look back. He didn't need to. Duke was running beside him, his ears pinned back, his body tense. The dog knew they were being pursued, and he wouldn't stop until his family was safe. A sharp whistle cut through the air, and Kyle recognized it instantly. Mark. He was signaling the others, directing them. Kyle gritted his teeth, increasing his pace. "Almost there," his father muttered beside him. "Keep moving." Kyle knew what he meant. The hunting blind was close, just beyond the ridge ahead. If they could make it there before the others caught up, they could turn this around. They could gain the upper hand. Sarah stumbled on a tree root, But Kyle was there in an instant, catching her before she could fall. "I've got you," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded quickly, breathless but determined. The ridge was steep, but they climbed it with purpose, their legs burning with the effort. Ben let out a small whimper, his little hands trembling. Sarah pulled him closer. "Just a little farther, sweetheart," she whispered. Then, finally, they reached it. The hunting blind was an old wooden structure, barely large enough to hold them all, but sturdy. It was raised a few feet off the ground, accessible by a narrow ladder. Kyle reached it first, dropping his bag and immediately helping Sarah and the kids up. His father followed, his movements practiced and quick. Duke scrambled up after them, his claws scraping against the wood as he settled inside. Kyle turned just in time to see Mark crest the ridge, his breath heavy, his hands clenched into fists. The two other men flanked him, their expressions dark with intent. Kyle didn't hesitate. He raised his father's shotgun, pointing it directly at them. "That's close enough." Mark lifted his hands slightly, palms facing outward, but the smirk on his face sent a chill down Kyle's spine. "Easy there, buddy. No need for that." Kyle's father scoffed. "You cut our phone lines. You've been circling our house. You think we're just going to talk this out?" Mark's eyes flickered toward the blind. "You're smarter than this, Kyle. You know what's happening here. You can feel it." Kyle's grip tightened on the shotgun. "The only thing I feel is that you need to leave. Now." One of Mark's men shifted slightly, and Duke let out a deep growl, his fur bristling. Kyle's father cocked the shotgun, the sound sharp and unmistakable. "I suggest you listen to my son." Mark exhaled slowly. "You think hiding out here changes anything? They know where you are. They know who you are. You can't outrun this." Kyle's chest tightened. "Who are they?" Mark's expression darkened. "People you don't want to meet." Kyle shook his head. "You already made that choice for me." A tense silence stretched between them, the only sounds the rustling leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Then, without another word, Mark took a step back, motioning to his men to do the same. "This isn't over," he said. "You'll see that soon enough." Kyle watched as they retreated, his finger still hovering near the trigger. He didn't relax until they were out of sight. His father let out a slow breath. "They'll be back." Kyle lowered the shotgun, his hands shaking slightly. "I know." Sarah's voice was soft, but firm. "What do we do now?" Kyle turned to her, his mind racing. "We prepare. We don't run. We don't hide. We stand our ground." His father nodded. "Then we make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Kyle sat in the hunting blind, his back pressed against the rough wooden planks as he stared out into the darkness. His father sat across from him, the shotgun resting on his lap, eyes scanning the trees. Sarah had managed to get the kids to rest in the corner, though neither of them was truly asleep. Duke lay at their feet, his ears twitching at every distant sound. "They'll come back," Kyle whispered. "Mark wouldn't just walk away." His father nodded, his jaw tight. "They want to wear us down, make us feel trapped." Kyle ran a hand through his hair. He was exhausted. They all were. But he couldn't afford to let it show. "We have to take control of this. We can't just wait." Sarah spoke softly. "We need a way out." Kyle's father shook his head. "No. We need to end this." Kyle glanced at him. You're thinking of taking the fight to them." His father exhaled sharply. "I don't like it any more than you do, but they're not going to stop. We stay, they escalate. We run, they follow. Only way this ends is if we make sure they don't get back up." Sarah's grip tightened around Emma's shoulders. "You're talking about killing them." His father didn't answer immediately. "I'm talking about protecting this family, whatever that takes." Kyle hesitated, but deep down, he knew his father was right. Mark and the others had been testing them, waiting for the moment they'd be weakest. That moment wasn't going to come. Kyle glanced down at Duke. The dog was still watching him, waiting. "We move before dawn," he said. "We take the fight to them." His father nodded. "I'll take the first shot. We make sure they don't have time to react." Sarah swallowed hard, but didn't argue. She knew what was at stake. The hours stretched on. Kyle barely moved, his body tense, his eyes flicking toward every sound in the woods. Then, just before the first hint of dawn, movement. Mark. He stood just beyond the trees, alone, or at least he wanted them to think he was. His posture was different this time, more deliberate. Kyle raised the shotgun, ready. "Kyle," Mark called out. "Let's talk." Kyle's father tensed beside him. "Not happening." Mark took another step forward. "You think this ends with me? You kill me, they send more. You run, they find you. This doesn't stop." Kyle's grip on the gun tightened. "Then we make it stop." Mark smiled faintly. "You think you can do that?" Kyle exhaled slowly. "I know we can." A sharp whistle cut through the air. Mark's signal. Kyle fired. Mark dropped before he could react, and instantly the woods exploded with movement. His father fired next, dropping one of the men in the tree line. Sarah pulled the kids to the floor, shielding them as Duke snarled and lunged forward, his instincts kicking in. Kyle moved fast, reloading, his pulse pounding in his ears. He fired again, hitting another one of Mark's men as they scrambled for cover. His father took out the last one, the final gunshot echoing through the trees. Then, silence. Kyle stood slowly, his breath coming in hard bursts. The bodies lay scattered around the clearing. It was over. Sarah clutched the kids, her face pale, but steady. "Is it done?" Kyle's father nodded grimly. "Yeah, it's done." Duke sniffed at the bodies but didn't linger. He knew too. The threat was gone. Kyle exhaled. They had survived. Sarah pulled him close, pressing her forehead against his. "We're safe now." Kyle wrapped an arm around her, looking down at their children. "Yeah, we are." Duke wagged his tail once, then lay down beside them, his job finished.